talking about auto layout. Auto layout is a way to lay out our views dynamically. Back when the iPhone first came out, the first couple years of the iPhone, we didn't have to worry about auto layout, right? We had one device, one size screen. The screen was about 320 by 480, whatever that was. So at that point, you could have hard-coded numbers. I could have been like, hey, my view is 320, so if I want to get to the center of it, divide that by 2, whatever it is. It's constant, right? It doesn't change. That was going on for a couple of years. Then the iPhone 5 came out, right? So the screen became taller. Now you have to worry about a different height of a device, right? After that, we got the iPhone 6, different size altogether. So as we started introducing new iPhones, we couldn't rely on one size anymore, right? We couldn't say, hey, it's 320 by whatever, 480. That doesn't exist anymore. And also you have the iPad as well. So you really can't rely on numbers. So then auto layout got introduced. Auto layout is a way to dynamically lay out your views. So if I'm running my app on an iPhone 4S, that same app should render, the view should be the same on an iPhone 11 Pro Max, right? So it shouldn't matter what device you're running on, your app should scale based on that device, right? So that, in a nutshell, is auto layout. And today we will start using auto layout in our applications. So let's go off to Xcode, create a single view application, call it auto layout. It's a single view app, it's an iOS app, and we're calling it auto layout. Single view app, simply call it auto layout. We're using storyboard. As we said earlier, with Swift UI, if you were to use Swift UI, auto layout is not part of Swift UI. Swift UI, as you code, your preview changes. So in the future, that's what you'll be doing. You code and your view changes dynamically. So there's no separation there. With UIKit, there's separation. You have storyboard, you could program your views using storyboard, or you could use auto layout via code, right? Those are the two ways in UIKit. Everybody? Right? So here we're using storyboard, not Swift UI. Core data is unchecked, unit test is unchecked, UI test is unchecked. We go next. I'm saving this on my desktop. Please do not check get here. We'll do get together at the end of the lesson. We'll push up our code to GitHub. Everybody? We did it before. We'll just do it again to get that muscle memory going. So make sure create get repository is not checked. And go ahead and click create. Auto layout. All right. Yeah, get is not checked. Okay, so we have our navigation window open. Navigate over to the storyboard. So click on storyboard. So here we have a single view. A single view is controlled by our single view controller. So far, we only have one view controller in this project. It came with the project. And we have one storyboard. Came with this project as well. So in that particular scene, we'll drag over a UI view. So go ahead and drag over a UI view. So go to your object library or Command-Shift-L and search for UI view. So drag a view over and use the layout guides, the vertical and the horizontal. So center it with the device. I'm centering my view with the device using the guidelines. I'll give my view a color. You could use any color you want. I will give it a background color here. Choose any color you want. So here I have my view. I have a view, it's centered. Currently, I have it on the iPhone 11, right? Everybody probably has it on the iPhone 11 too, correct? View as iPhone 11 is the default? For now, we did not change it. It should be iPhone 11, correct? Correct? Okay, great. So here I'm viewing, yes, go ahead. Click on it and it will pop up. I haven't changed the view as. The view as is still the default 11. So view as is still default 11. Okay? Let's zoom into the devices we have. If I zoom into the devices I have here, the smallest iPhone I have is a 4S, iPhone 4S, right? If I click on the iPhone 4S, do we all see our iPhone 4S? Right? The smallest device to the right side, do we see that? Go ahead and click on the iPhone 4S. What happened? Right? So we laid our view, like we did for the last 2 weeks, using a particular iPhone. We ran it on the simulator with that same iPhone. It renders correctly, as we stated, correct? But here, if I laid it out using the iPhone 11, and I go to, say, an iPhone 4S, it's not the same. It's not centered anymore, right? Again, because that's a different size device. We had our layout was based on the dimensions of the iPhone 11. We went to an iPhone 4S. The dimensions are different. Our view is no longer centered. That's where auto layout comes in. Yes, sir. The 7. What does it have? The 8, right? It's Apple. Apple decides what they want to have there. Cool. Okay, at some point you might not see the 4 anymore, but the 5 might still stay. There's some nations still supporting, like third-party nations is still on the 4, right? Not everybody could afford those $1,000 devices. Cool. All right, so here we go. So back on iPhone 4S, our view is not centered anymore. So let's go back to our iPhone 11. Our view is centered on the iPhone 11, correct? Let's go to an iPad. Go to the leftmost iPad, the iPad 11, 12.9, third generation. And let's see look at that. That's like all off, right? On the iPad here, my view is to the top right, to the top left somewhere. I want my view to be centered, right? I want my view to be centered. So let's go ahead and use auto layout to achieve that. So let's go back to our iPhone 11. Right now, I'm on my iPhone 11. Right? I'll zoom into the bottom right here, right above where it says vary for traits. I'll zoom in at the bottom right. Right? Everybody could see where my mouse is. That says align. For today, what we will really be using is align, that align button, to center our view horizontally. Align centers the view horizontally and vertically. And we'll also use the add new constraints button, right? And to the right of that, we also have resolve auto layout issues. What does that mean? For example, if we did a constraint on a view, we could remove the constraints and start over. One of the beginning problems, or anytime, you might have a button that you constrain or a view that you constrain and it's all off. So you want to start again from scratch. So this button here will remove the constraints on a particular view for you. Or you could also use Apple's recommended. You could also use Apple's recommended recommendations for the constraints. Most likely it might not be what you want, but it's available for us. Very similar to when we have a bug in our code, there's a fix-it button. There's also like a fix-it button in constraints. But most likely it won't give you that outcome you're looking for, right? Okay, question. When I'm saying constraints, I'm talking about constraining one view to a next view. I want my view to be centered of its parent view. I need to add constraints to it. Constraints to the top, constraints for the height. Like, how do I size it? In what relation? Right, very good question. So in what relation, what's the relationship between this blue view and the white view? I need constraints in order to make that work.
And we do it by ourselves, like when we drive the mouse and give it a
We'll do it together. We'll use the align button and we'll use the add new constraints button. And also we'll be doing control drag as well. There's many ways to do auto layout and add constraints to a view, right? So we'll see how we add constraints now. Cool? All right, so I'll zoom back here. So we selected, make sure you select your blue view. Make sure that you select your blue view. So you could select on the white screen and go back to the blue. That way you confirm that you do select the blue view. Everybody? Great. So here I'm going to go to my align button. Remember I said the align button at the bottom right? Do we see the align button? Yep. Click on the align button. Yeah, with the blue highlighted. Make sure your blue view is highlighted and click on the align button. So our align button is here. We see horizontally in container, correct? And we see vertically in container, correct? So the objective of what we want to do, we want to center it horizontally and we want to center it vertically. So to add the constraints or to add the way it's related to its parent view, we will go ahead and click in on those boxes. So I will set a constraint. Setting the constraint meaning I want to commit a change to that view. I want to tell that view, you need to be laid out horizontally to your super view. Okay? You need to be laid out horizontally, left to right, center of the white view. Everybody? Right? So I click on that box. Now it's blue. I've added a constraint. I haven't committed the constraint. As you see, I clicked on it. Do you see add one constraint here? If you unclick on it, the constraint got grayed out. Everybody? So even if you check on it, you haven't added it unless you click on the add button. Okay? So I also want to lay it out vertically, right? Vertically, top down. Top down to the white view. Everybody? Okay, so I will click on it. At that point, I'll press add two constraints because I'm adding two constraints. Center vertically, center horizontally. Okay? Horizontally is the same as saying center at the x-axis. Everybody? Right? So center horizontally is the same as saying center of x. Right? Vertically is the same as saying center y. Okay? So I'll press add to constraints. I'll zoom back. And look at that. Even storyboard gives us errors. Right? Do we see the red lines? The red lines indicate that there's an error in our auto layout. Auto layout here has an error. So I have my two lines showing me I have an error. The error I have here, if we click, do we see that red dot here, the red arrow? Do we see the red arrow here in the document outline? So that red arrow or red circle, if we click on it, it will tell us what are we missing, what we're missing. Like why, basically, auto layout doesn't know how to correctly lay out our view. We're missing things. Center Y and center X is not enough because our view, the view that we see here, doesn't know its size. Later, we'll see that a label, when we have a label knows its size. A view does not, right? That's called intrinsic value. A label knows its intrinsic value, but a view does not know that, right? With a label, how does it know its intrinsic value? It has contents. It has characters in there. So it knows its size and its height. Yes, go ahead.
What about the button?
A button doesn't know. If you put an image in there, then it will know some size. Exactly. Very good. So here our view doesn't have enough information. The view needs to know its height and its width, right? So here the center Y, center X is not enough to satisfy the constraints. That's why we got two error messages. One error message says that need constraints for the X position, meaning I need to know the width, and I need constraints for the Y position, meaning I need to know the height. So let's zoom back here. We'll use Add New Constraints button. So click on the Add New Constraints button. The Add New Constraints button is to the right of the Align button here, if I zoom back in. Right? So here we have our Align button, and to the right of it, we have the Add New Constraints button. right? So click on the Add New Constraints button, right? Do we see width and height? For now, check width and height. It should say Add 2 constraints, correct? Don't worry about the sizes we have here. Whatever size you have, go with the size you have, okay? Mine has 240 by 128. More on that later. But for now, I'm saying my width is 240 and my height is 128, okay? Don't change yours if yours is whatever it is. Everybody with me? Okay, so now I will add 2 constraints again. So for now, how many constraints do we have in all? We have 4 constraints, right? So let me zoom back. Do we have any red lines? No more red lines because auto layout now has no errors. Look, if you see here, it says no layout issues. Do we see that? No layout issues. No more layout issues. We have laid out our view sufficiently to see the constraints we have on a view. We click on the view, so I'm going to click back out. I'm going to click on the white area. I'll click back on my blue view, right? I will go to the size inspector. So the size inspector is to the right of the attributes inspector. Do we see the size inspector? With the ruler, the vertical ruler, that's called the size inspector. Click on the size inspector. The size inspector will show us all the constraints we have. Right? So do we see the constraints? How many constraints do we have? 4, right? Horizontal constraints, we have 2. We have a center X, and we have a width of 240. Everybody? For the vertical constraints, we have a center Y with the super view. Do we see super view here? It says align center Y to super view. We saw that? And we also have a height of 128 here for now. Okay? So we have 4 constraints on that particular view. We are good to go. We could test our code. And where do we see the constraints? In the size inspector. I could edit, I could double click, I could edit my constraints here, right? For example, if I want to edit my height, I could edit, click on the edit button, and edit the constant. We see a constant of 128. I could edit that number, right? So I could say 200 here and press enter. My view updates. Click out. I could go back to my width here, and I could say 200 as well, and press enter, right? My constraints are still okay. They're still blue lines. I could also edit the number here, right? So I could edit the constraints after I've added them. Let's zoom back. Great, so now we have some square here. Okay, let's run our application. I'll run my application on an iPhone 11 Pro Max.
Does that mean we can't change the size?
Yeah, you can. Okay, so I run my phone on my 11 Pro Max. There we go. All right, so I have my center blue box. Everybody got the blue box centered, right? Go ahead and click down Command and the right arrow. Command right arrow, it takes your phone into landscape. Your view should still be centered, correct? Correct? You could keep turning that phone using the right arrow here. Your view should also always be centered here. Is it still centered? Great, so I'm back in portrait mode. So this is portrait mode, and this is landscape mode, okay? So to go back from that landscape back to portrait, I could go left. So command left, right, or command right, cool? So our view is still centered, right? So let's get practice here. I will click on my box again. Click on the box. Remember we said we have a reset constraints. So if we go back down to where it says, do we see where it says resolve? Let me zoom in here. Do we see resolve constraints? That little triangle arrow to the right of the add new constraints, where my mouse is, do we see resolve? Click on resolve. I need to zoom here. So click on resolve and make sure it says selected views, not all views. There's two sections. Do we see that? One section, the top section says selected views. The bottom section says all views. Don't make the mistake of having 10 views all laid out already and take out all the constraints on that, right? So be careful there. So, what's that? I mean, you could Command Z, right? But just be intentional with what you want to do. So here, we just want to remove the constraints on the blue view. Right now, we only have one view anyway. So you want to say clear constraints. Do we see clear constraints? Click on clear constraints. At this point, all our layout, our auto layout is gone. It's back to what we did yesterday and before. Run the app again. Run the application again. Run the application again. Our view is basically about centered, correct? Yes? But if we go landscape, what happened? We go landscape is no longer centered, right? So your job is not to use Command Z, but to recreate the constraints. Okay? So recreate the constraints we just created. Okay? Yes, sir. It's not supported in Xcode. You have to check it. Because upside down is not a good, right? It's a bit weird there to see views upside down. So go back and recreate the constraints. Yes, yes, sir. Oh, so click on the blue box. Let's go again. So click on the blue box, right? And go down to our constraints area. Let me zoom in. Do you see that little triangle here? So click on it. Do you see selected views? One. Do you see selected views? When you click on the triangle, does a dialog come up? Click on the blue box. A triangle comes up, and dialog comes up, and click on clear constraints. Make sure you selected your blue view. Yes, yes. All right, cool. So do that and reproduce what we just produced earlier. Everybody know what we're doing, correct? All right. Because again, auto layout takes a lot of practice. Even this looks a bit trivial, but again, doing it yourself and recreating it is essential. No matter what phone, exactly, exactly.
What was the size? The size should be?
Right now we have a hardcoded size. The next part of this is going to have it proportional in size to the size of the device. You run it, and then you put it in landscape. Cool. Great. Yeah, that's a lot. Yeah. Everybody got their landscape going? Test it in landscape, right? Make sure it's still centered. Landscape. That's why it was off. Give me a thumbs up when you get it. All right, cool. We all got it, right? Mostly I saw landscapes were working. Anybody still working on it? Anybody still working on it? Cool. Double check Andy when you. Okay, so let's go back here and create what we had. So Jahid was bringing up a good point here. He's coming from a Photoshop background, and he was asking, how can I, his question was, how can I know what view I'm dealing with, right? Because at some point we'll have more views here in our view hierarchy. When I talk about view hierarchy, our parent view is called view. Everybody? Our parent view is called view. If I open up my parent view, I'm in the document outline. I'm in the document outline. My parent view is view. Currently, I added a new view called blue view, right? We could click once on that view here. I could click once. It will allow me to edit. So if I click once on the view I want to edit, I could change the name. So click once on it. What I'm doing, I highlight what view I want to edit the name of it. I click once on it. Does it go into edit mode? Does it go into edit mode for you, right? So now I could simply say blue view. That's fine, right? So now I know what view is the blue view. Cool? All right, great. So let's zoom back here and let's add my constraints again. Again, to go back through what we did. Because Jen, look at mine. This, right? Mine doesn't have an extra safe area on the view. Right? Okay, great. So the first thing we did, we clicked on our blue view. We went to the align button, and we added horizontal and vertical constraints, right? I clicked on add to constraints, and I got my red line. My red line tells me I am missing a width and a height. How do I know? I go to my red dot here, and it tells me blue. It tells me blue view needs constraints, right? Blue view needs constraints for X position or width, right? We have a constraint already for the X position, but we need a width. And for the blue view, we also need a height because the view doesn't know its intrinsic height. So let's go back and add that. So we click back on the blue view. This time we went to add new constraints. In add new constraints, we added a width and a height constraint, right? And we said add to constraints. At this point, we have blue lines everywhere. No more layout issues, right? Say that again. No, it wouldn't. As long as we have the constraints, it needs to be satisfied. So every question was, if we do it in reverse, would it still be the same? It would still work. Cool? So now, again, you don't have to run the simulator to check this. Everybody? I do not have to run my simulator because on our low resource devices here, our 8 gig device, it takes a while every time to run a different simulator. If you have that power machine, that Mac Pro, right, that Eric is going to buy me for my birthday, which is, right, 10K and counting, plus the stand. Don't forget the stand. Right? But we could use, do we see the orientation here at the bottom? Do we see orientation? So the current orientation is highlighted in blue. Current orientation is what? What's the phone in now? It's in portrait, right? So I could click on landscape right here, right in the canvas. I do not need to run the simulator to see how it renders, right? And here it still renders centered, correct? I could stay here and change the device. I could change the device I want to see it on. I could go to the iPhone 4S, right? Still works. I could change the orientation on my iPhone 4S. Still works. I could go to the iPad 12.9-inch, which is to the left, the leftmost iPad here. The leftmost iPad, I could click on it, and it still renders. I mean, yes, I probably have to zoom in because my device is a bit small here, right? But it's still centered on the iPad. I put my iPad in landscape mode. It's still centered. So here we've successfully auto-laid out our view. Doesn't matter what device it's running on. Everybody? Okay, cool. What's the question? You what? Oh, okay. All right. How is Andy doing? Good. Okay, perfect. So let's go back to our iPhone Pro Max here. And let me go back to portrait. Great. So let's work on the next view. This time we will create a new view controller, not a view controller class. We'll get to that next week. But we'll drag in a new view controller to work on a different view. Because we don't want to delete this. We want to keep this for our own practice. So we'll create a new view to work on a new view. Everybody? So here, let's do some house cleaning. This view controller, let's zoom in here. My view controller, I will click on it once. Click on view controller here. Let me show us again. So I'm going to close my view scene. My scene is closed. Everybody? I will open up my scene. I'll click once on the view controller to highlight it. Yes? I'll click once again, and I'll give it a name. Because now we'll have a bunch of views we have here, so I want to identify which one this one is. So here I'll say Autolayout 1 is good. I'll copy Autolayout 1 here, and I'll just press enter. So this is my first view we've worked on. It's just called Autolayout 1. I'll go back to my scene. I'll click on my view controller here. Do we all see where it says Autolayout 1 here? The top black bar? Click on that first button and go to Identity Inspector. So go over to the Identity Inspector. Identity Inspector is to the left of the Attributes Inspector. Do we see Identity Inspector? Okay, click on it. Do we see where it says Storyboard ID? All right. So in Storyboard ID, go ahead and type in Auto Layout or paste in Auto Layout 1 if you copied it. So in Storyboard ID, you could enter Auto Layout 1 and press enter. Okay? All right. We're doing that just because we have multiple views we'll be laying out, right? And we need to give it a Storyboard ID because we'll get a warning from Xcode if we do not give it an ID, and we have multiple storyboards in here without any connection. Everybody? We'll see what that warning looks like when we bring in the next view controller. So everybody has a storyboard ID called Auto Layout 1, right? Great. So let's zoom back here. Bring up your object library. So Command-Shift-L. Search for View Controller. Type in View Controller. So type in View Controller, or start typing in View Controller. Do we see a View Controller show up? Drag it in like you drag in any other button, but not on your View Controller, right? So just drag it onto your canvas, drag it onto your canvas right next to your first view here. We could actually align it. There's blue guidelines too to align it, like if you want to be really nice and neat, right? We could align it so it's like vertically aligned. Yes? Do we see the blue guidelines? Drop it in, then you could reposition it. So we dragged in a second view controller, correct? At this point, we might see a warning. Do we see a warning? In my menu, my very top menu. Do you see a warning? Where my mouse is here. Do you see a warning here? You should see a warning. If you dragged in a view controller, you must have a warning. All right? If you click on the warning, let me zoom back here. So if I click on the warning and I go to my navigation window, what does it say? right? So there's a couple things we could do. It says view controller is unreachable because it has no entry points and no identifier for run access time. So what we could do exactly what we just did. Give it a storyboard ID. So we'll go back to the identity inspector for that particular view controller and call it Autolayout 2. And press enter, and that warning will go away. Okay? Because right now, storyboard doesn't know how to get to that view controller. The way it knows to get to that view controller, as we'll see next week, one, if you explicitly drag a connection from one view controller to an X, or you give it a storyboard ID. How can I know to call a mini without some name? I don't want to say hey, like who's hey, right? So a mini has a name. So our storyboard needs a name. The name is the storyboard ID. Right, everybody? So to resolve that warning, go back to the storyboard ID for the second view controller, click on the view controller, go to Identity Inspector, and enter Auto Layout 2, because this is the second example we're doing. The second way we'll see next week. You control drag from one view controller to an X. But for the purposes of what we're doing today, we don't need to get there yet. But just to get rid of all the warnings, we add in a storyboard ID. We could easily don't add it, but we'll get asked questions, hey, why am I getting warnings here? So the warnings is because explicitly we have to put a storyboard ID in there. Cool, so let's go back here. So I'll click on my second view controller. I'll click on my second view controller, the second one I entered, right? And I'm going to, where am I going? Identity Inspector, right? And I'm going to where it says Storyboard ID here, and I'm adding in Storyboard Auto Layout 2, and I'm pressing Enter. Make sure you press Enter. Again, anything you do in Inspector, in the Inspector window, press Enter on it to commit. Right? So I press Enter, and my warning should have gone away. It's gone away. We have no warnings. So far, so good? Great. All right, let's lay out a second view. This time, we won't use hard-code numbers. The first view uses hard-code numbers. What I mean by hard-code numbers, my view is 200 by 200. Everybody? If I want my view to scale with the device, I could use a multiplier on the parent view. So I could say the width should be half the parent view. I could say the height should be 3/4 the parent view. Everybody? So it scales with the device. Okay? So that's what we'll do for the second example. We will have a view scale up to the device, the size of the box itself. All right, great. So let's go ahead and drag in a box here, a view, not a box. There's no box. So get a view, UI view, not a view controller, but a UI view, just a view here. So we're dragging in a view to our second view controller. Use the blue guidelines to center it. Great. And here, give it any color you want. I'll give mine a red color. Red color. System red. Great. Again, we have no error messages yet. Because first of all, we haven't used auto layout, right? So we have no errors. Everybody clear with that? And if we don't use auto layout, we know what happens. That view will not be centered on a different device. So we need to go ahead and add auto layout to it. What's the first step should we do here in that particular view? Yes, Tiffany? Align. So we go to align. Okay. Very good. So here we add into constraints according to Tiffany. We went to the align button. We selected horizontal in container, meaning X, center X, and vertical in container, meaning center Y. Center Y where? Center Y of the super view. Okay? If I was to center myself in the room, I'm the red view, I go to the center of the room. Center of the room is both X and Y. I'm not center of the room unless I'm centered Y and X. Everybody? Cool. So here I will add 2 constraints. At this point, let me zoom my phone here. At this point, we have red lines because why? Why is the constraints not done here? Why is auto layout complaining? What's the other constraints?
Add constraint.
Yeah, we need height and we need width, right? That's why we currently have errors. We have two errors from auto layout because we're missing, if we click on our error message here, we're missing a width. We're missing a width and a height, right? So, as we said earlier, we won't hard code those numbers in because the next step would be if you wanted to use some constant height. If you wanted to use a constant height, you would click on the red box, and where would you go? If we did what we did for the blue view, where would we go to add a width and a height? We would go to add new constraints, right? And then we would select height and width. Everybody? Everybody? But we do not want to do that here, okay? In that particular view, we want to scale it based on the parent view, okay? When I say scale it, I want it to be proportioned to some number based on the super view. Our super view is the white view. The super view of the red view is the white view. Yes. Cool. All right, so let's actually give our red view a name like we did earlier. So here, the super view, again, is that parent view here. We could give our view controller a name like we did earlier. So here I will say this one is Autolayout 2. Right? So this is the parent view. I'm not going to change it to parent view, but you can if you want. And this one is the red view. I will edit it to say red view. Right? So auto layout 2 is our second view controller. The parent view is the top view in the hierarchy. If we open up our parent view, in our parent view, we have a red view. Let's talk a little bit about this safe area here. If you click on safe area, do you see a lightly blue highlight over your view? Right? So I click back on my red view, it's all white. If I click on the safe area view, it highlights like a blue section. Do we see that? Let's see what that looks like. So let me zoom back here. Let's scale that up a little bit. Let me get rid of my view as button. All right. On the iPhone 10 introduced a notch, right? The notch has the face camera and all that hotness there. I'm still on an iPhone 7. Again, Eric is going to get me an iPhone 10. Cool. So let's talk about the safe area. The safe area is that blue area. The blue area, the blue highlighted area we see there, that is the safe area. What do we mean when we say safe area? You do not want to have a button past the safe area. That safe area here, I do not want to have my user click right by the notch. This is bad UX, right? If you see an app with an X button somewhere in the notch there, it will get bad reviews, right? Because that's not where you want to have an element. If you have any element that the user needs to interact with, when I say interact, they need to click on it to do something. You do not put it beyond the safe area. Apple defines the safe area as where you should have content that the user interacts with. So where the user interacts with is where that blue highlight is, right? Your background color could pass the safe area, no problem. Nobody cares about touching a background color. But if you have a UI button, you do not put a UI button in the notch area or below where the home button is. Okay? That's what we mean by safe area. Let's go to the documentation, Apple documentation here. I slacked out that link, right? The link with the adaptive and layout, right? So this is coming from the Human Interface Guidelines, better known as HIG, right? HIG. So if somebody asks you, have you read the HIG before? Right? They're referring to the Human Interface Guideline. What is the Human Interface Guideline? Apple came up with this documentation to let its developers know the best way to design the UI, right? You should not have a button beyond the safe area, right? You should not use Android UI specifications on an iPhone. Things like that. All that is documented in the Human Interface Guidelines. Before you ship an app to the App Store, you review the Human Interface Guidelines. Am I within all the guidelines of Apple? So here, what we've seen here, we're in the adaptive. As a matter of fact, make sure we bookmark the human interface guideline, right? So if we go down here, there's different sizes and dimensions of devices, right? Again, we don't hard code numbers, but for purposes of like screenshots and stuff like that, you need to get to those dimensions. But in code, we do not hard code numbers. When I say hard coding, I mean we're not saying we expect the device to be 420 by 280. We don't do that anymore, right? So here, if we keep going down, we talk about auto layout here. It defines what auto layout is, right? It's adaptive, dynamic for devices. We keep going down here. It talks about layout guides and safe area. It shows us where the safe area is, right? So the safe area is that blue line here. So you have your notch. Below the notch, you cannot put in that white space there. Do not put any controls in that white space. You could put controls anywhere in that safe area. So when we talk about safe area, that's what we're talking about. And that purplish margin there, that's the margin. There's a default margin. As we pull our view to the right and the left, those blue guidelines we see there, that's the margins, right? It also shows you iPad. Look at that. iPad, you could go all the way to the top, right? So Greg, you're free to do whatever you want to do there until the notch comes. Cool. All right, great. So this is talking about safe area. Let's get back. And again, please bookmark the human interface guidelines. There's a lot of stuff there. All right, great. So this view will be a bit more challenging to set up. So we'll pay attention and we'll recreate it again like we recreated the first one. So what we want to do here, first off, we have centered vertically and horizontally. We have two constraints. We're missing two more constraints to satisfy that view. We'll use control drag. You could control drag from one view. Again, auto layout is all about laying out a view relative to a different view. You can't lay out a view by itself. It lives in space. Everybody? I need to lay myself out based on the room, right? Currently, I am to the front, to the left, or to you to the right, right? I need to lay myself out relative to something else. Unless I do all required parts of that, I'll get those red lines, I'll get errors. So here we'll be using control drag from the red view over to the safe area and use equal width and equal heights, and then we'll go ahead and edit those equal width and equal heights to some proportion, to some multiplier, to some ratio, okay? So we could also control drag in the document outline. We'll actually control drag in the document outline right now. So make sure your document outline is open. Document outline, again, is found below here, right where it says View as iPhone. Do we all see View as iPhone? Is our document outline open? Great. So let me zoom back here. For now, let's close out Auto Layout 1. We just need Auto Layout 2 to be open, right? So my Auto Layout 1 scene is closed, and my Auto Layout 2 scene is open. I did document my red view as red view. If your view is a different color, you call it a different color here. So what I want to do is control drag from the red view right here. I'll control drag from the red view up to the safe area. So let's go ahead and do that. So control drag from the red view up to the safe area. Everybody? If you've done it successfully, you should see a dialog box come up. Did we see a dialog box? Let's do it again. I want to control drag from my red view up to my safe area. Correct? Yes?
So we should only have the center and height.
That's all we have. No width, no height. Only two constraints currently. And if we want to verify how many constraints we have, where do we go? The where? The ruler. The identity inspector. Thank you, sir. Right? Okay. So we control drag from the red view up to the safe area. Do we see the safe area highlighted? At this point, we drop our mouse. Do we see a dialog box come up? Right? Here we have all the constraints we could use. For our purposes, we want to get equal width and equal heights. You could select multiple constraints in that particular dialog box. You select multiple constraints by holding down on the Shift button. Holding down on the Shift button, and you click as to which constraints you want. In our case, we want to shift and click on equal widths and equal heights. Right? So I will hold down the Shift button. I will click on equal widths. There's a check mark. You keep holding down Shift and equal heights. Everybody? At this point, I have two constraints checked. Correct? And we're done. I could mouse click outside here. So I could basically just mouse click out and zoom back here. Click on my red. At this point, there's no red line, correct? There's no errors. Are there any errors? No. We have more editing to do. We have more editing to do. That's fine. That's fine. We'll edit it right now. If your box went, we'll edit it right now, okay? I don't question Xcode too much. So Xcode and I, we have our differences sometimes, but yeah. All right, so let's go to the identity inspector. Make sure you select on your red box. Make sure your red box is still selected. Go to the identity inspector. Everybody go to your identity inspector. How many constraints do you have? How many constraints do we have? Everybody? 4, right? We have 4 constraints. Do we see a proportional width constraint? Do we see a proportional width constraint? So currently I have center X, I have center Y, I have proportional width to safe area, and I have proportional height to safe area. You have equal, not proportion. Okay, let's redo it. Let's redo it. So let me delete them. Just delete 2. So let's delete it together. Let's see how to delete it. To delete a constraint, you go to Identity Inspector. Let me zoom in. Let's make sure we see everything here. Click on the constraint. So sorry. What did I say? Identity, sorry. You go to the size inspector. Click on the one you want to delete. So in my case, I want to delete proportional width. I click on the constraint I want to delete, and I simply press delete. We have to do it again over because some people got the constraint wrong. And it's also good to know how to delete constraints. So I go to my proportional height, and I press delete. Right? So now we're back to having X and Y center. Correct? What's your align? Go back to portrait. Let's do it all over again together. Let's do all over again, it's fine. Constraints are good to do over and over. I'll delete my X, I'll delete my Y. Remove all constraints. We're back to square one. Smaller the box right now. What's that? How do you get the box? You drag in the UI view. Remember we dragged in a UI view earlier for the first example? You drag in a UI view and you give it a color, a background color. Cool? Make it smaller. Just make it smaller. Click on it and drag it in. Oh, go to make it easier, click on your box. If your box is a white box, click on your box. Go to the size inspector. Everybody go to the size inspector. If your box is bigger than you want it to be, doesn't really matter. Go to the identity inspector. Sorry, go to the size inspector. Do we see width and height? Make sure your box is selected. Is your box selected? And here you could just give it a width and a height. So I could give it 200 by 400, for example. Press enter. The height. Height, press enter. And then move the box into center. 400 is big, so make it 200 by 200. Again, we'll scale that later. The size doesn't matter now. Okay, great. We have no warnings right now. We have no constraints. Yes, sir. No, all the constraints are gone. All right, so we're starting again from scratch. You have a box, right? You have a squared box or whatever box you have. It's centered with the blue guidelines, correct? Correct? Okay, what's the first thing we do? We want to center at X and Y. What do we do? Okay. Okay, everybody got Tiffany, right? So I go to a line, I do horizontally aligned and vertically aligned, I add two constraints. Currently, our box should still be that square we put in there. So far, so good. Next step, we want to proportion our red box relative to its parent view. Yes? Oh, we'll do it together. Cool? So now I want to make sure my document outline is open. I zoom in on my document outline here. What is that? Oh, that, okay, so, all right. So what do? We control drag from the red view. Control drag from the red view. Control drag from the red view over to your safe area. Everybody, to the safe area. Equal width and equal heights. Shift, click, equal width, shift, click. That's fine, that's fine, that's fine, that's not a problem, we'll get there. Press enter or just mouse over. That's fine. We'll see how it proportions itself later. Let's edit it. You should have a proportion. You don't have a proportion.
It's your computer. It's not specifically in the constraint section, it will say that
Okay, it's gonna work the same for you guys. Maybe I'm on 11.2, maybe something got different there. Everybody, proportion height for you is the same as equal height, okay? So let's keep editing here. Everybody, let's pay attention. So let's go ahead to the size inspector. Let's go to the size inspector. How many constraints do you have? 4. Where yours says equal width, press on the edit button. Wherever it says equal width for you, for mine it says proportional width, press on the edit button. Do we see edit? Click on the edit button. Do we see where it says multiplier? You should have multiplier, correct? All right. Where it has multiplier here, simply put in 0.5. Put in 0.5 for the multiplier. Press enter. Did it change the size? Very good. Where it says equal height, select edit. Where it says equal height, edit the multiplier. Put like 0.6. 0.6 implies 60%. 0.6 implies 60%. 0.5 implies 50%. So here we'll put 0.6 or whatever numbers you want. Feel free to be innovative here. All right. So you should have some sort of view proportion based on some ratio, right? For mine, it's about, as I said, 0.5 or 50% of the width and 0.6 or 60% of the height. Everybody? Did everybody's view render correctly? Very good. So now let us go to our view as. So go to view as, select the smallest iPhone, which is the 4S. It should render correctly, right? It's proportion to the height, proportion to the width. Right now, we're no longer saying it's hard-coded 100 by 100. Everybody? If you go to the iPad 12.9, go to the iPad 12.9, and if I zoom in, right? The iPad is also proportioned correctly. Go ahead and put it in landscape. Put it in landscape. Also proportioned correctly, right? Now, as we go on break here, let's go ahead and remove the constraints and do it again ourselves.
Wait, before you do that.
Before I do that, yes.
If you change the size of the view, the constraints will adjust automatically, right?
Yeah, the multiplier. If you do the multiplier.
If you do the multiplier, then you change the size of the view.
Yeah, so right now I could do the multiplier. So say I want to make the height taller.
Oh, I see.
I would edit it. So I would go back to the height. I would edit for like 80%, right? Press enter. Cool. So you could edit based on whatever you want. Everybody? Okay, so here we break, we go on break. But as you go on break, you're going to remove your constraints. You're going to click on the red box. You will go to reset constraints. And you will clear constraints, correct? Yes? All right, so clear constraints, and you'll do it over again. So we'll break for 15 minutes. You come back at 12:10.